At 3 p.m. on Friday, April the 3rd, in the year 33, a powerful 6.0 magnitude earthquake struck the city of Jerusalem. Geologists from the German Research Center for Geoscience have actually found incontrovertible evidence of this quake. They found it in sediments that had been laid down by the water washing out of ravines along the shore of the Dead Sea. And in those sediments, they found wavy lines of sediments that indicated that in the year 31, plus or minus 5 years, at that particular time, this earthquake did in fact take place. They looked at the dating in the rocks, which is just a simple matter of doing the science, and then they looked at the historical sources, such as the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, and they realized that the only historical record of an earthquake at that particular time would have to have been on April the 3rd, the year 33, right at Passover, and in fact, right on the afternoon that we call Good Friday. This earthquake toppled at least one important building just yards from the temple complex in Jerusalem. Stone walls came crashing down. People poured into the streets. A cloud of dust rose slowly over the city. Within the temple itself, the walls shifted sufficiently to cause the great temple veil to be torn in two from top to bottom. And just outside the city walls, 3 crosses trembled like reeds in the wind. Soldiers and bystanders struggled to keep their footing. When the Roman centurion in charge of the 3 crucifixions looked up at the center cross, he could see that its victim was dead. In awe, he proclaimed, "Surely this man was the Son of God." In the distance, a large group of women struggled back to their feet. They included Mary Magdalene, a woman named Mary, the mother of James the Younger and Joseph, and a woman named Salome. They had followed Jesus all the way from the earliest days in Galilee, and now they were present at the end of his journey. Death is a mysterious thing even today. Imagine how much more mysterious it was at a time when there were no stethoscopes, when there were no heart monitors, when there were no ways to try to figure out exactly when a person died. Even to this day, there are studies after studies that come out telling us about brain activity X number of minutes after the heart stops beating, and every so often a story of someone who's pronounced dead and then is discovered to actually just be in a very deep coma, and to everyone's surprise, they wake up. So how could we know that Jesus really died? That was a question then as it is now. And it was even more so a question when it came to crucifixion. You see, victims of crucifixion regularly spent 2 or 3 agonizing days on the cross. Death came all too slowly. Of course, that was the point. No wonder then that the Roman governor Pilate was surprised to find a prominent member of the Jewish society and a member of the Sanhedrin coming to him that afternoon asking permission to bury the criminal's body. Pilate conducted his own investigation before granting this unusual permission. In Mark 15:44-45, we read, Pilate was surprised to hear that he, Jesus, was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body, literally the word there is now the corpse, to Joseph. Joseph went back to Golgotha to bury Jesus before sunset in keeping with Jewish law. Verse 46, we read, so Joseph bought some fine linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in linen, placed it in a tomb cut out of the rock. And then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. End of the story. The bad guys came out on top. The good guy lost. The sun set on the same old, broken world. Or so it seemed. Now, this tomb in which Joseph buried the body of Jesus was a very typical tomb of that time. It was cut out of solid rock. It would have to have been a rich person's tomb because of all the labor that went into creating such a tomb. These tombs typically had a front chamber, almost like a porch area that was carved into the rock. And then in the back of that front chamber was a tiny doorway, just 2 feet by 2 feet. So how big is that door? Well, let's see. So this would be so by so. Be kind of like, yeah, crawling under the piano. Tiny little door. It wasn't really meant to be used very often. Inside that little tiny door was a chamber about 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet, and a good portion of it was taken up by a rock shelf in which the body would be placed. Then after some long period of time, loved ones would come back and collect the bones of the deceased, put them in a little box, and put them in a little niche that was carved into the wall. This tomb then would serve for various family members over the years. In the fading light, Joseph and his servants carried Jesus' body down into this old quarry where the tomb had been carved. One of them crawled into the tomb through that little tiny 2-foot by 2-foot door, and the rest passed the body through that little opening, and then they together crawled in, put the body on the shelf, arranged some spices to help prevent the odor of decomposition, crawled back out of the tomb in the fading light, rolled the stone over the doorway, and went home. Mark tells us that their every move was carefully observed by at least 2 of the women who had been at the cross. Verse 47, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Now, all of these little details are important. They were very important for Mark as he told this story to primarily a Roman audience, a people who never had been to Jerusalem, and people who would be hearing this amazing story. And he is helping them understand there was no question about the fact that Jesus died. It was witnessed by these women from a distance. It was witnessed by the centurion who was in charge of making sure that the prisoner died. It was witnessed by this man Joseph who took the body down and then wrapped it in cloths. Basically, Joseph was hands-on performing these funeral rites with the body of Jesus. There was no question as to where Jesus was placed. The tomb was a known place. It belonged to a particular individual, and these women watched the whole process, taking it down and eventually being able then to talk about that with eyewitness reports for the rest of their lives. 36 hours after Jesus was buried, the same 3 women who had been watching him die on the cross came to finish his funeral. Mark chapter 16, verse 1. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, same women, bought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Now, in Jewish times, back in Jesus' day, the day started at sunset, the opposite of how we think. It started at sunset. Sabbath, you couldn't do any work, couldn't buy anything. So at sundown on a Saturday night, they went out, the stores opened up, all of a sudden it was time to start the new week, and they were able to buy these spices, go to bed, because by now it was too dark to perform this funeral, and then be ready to go in the morning. So we read very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? They had been with Jesus from the very beginning of his story. Mark tells us that they came with him from this northern part of Israel called Galilee. Now he was gone, and their mission that day was to give his story a proper ending. To basically make sure that this person that they honored and that they loved and that they had hoped was God's king would at least be buried in a civilized and a loving and an honorable way. Whatever story they thought they were ending, however, was blown to pieces by what happened next. For starters, when they got to the tomb, the stone had already been rolled away, and that tiny black opening stood open to the world. Undaunted, the 3 women got down on all fours, like that, and squeezed their way into the tomb. There were no men there, by the way. Just a little comment on who's braver between the 2 sexes. Imagine their terror when they crawled into that little dark 6 by 6 space and found they were not alone. Verse 5 says, as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side. and they were alarmed. That puts it nicely, right? How would you feel if you crawled into a pitch black tomb and found somebody sitting there where the body was supposed to be? I don't know about you, but if my wife is right behind me and I don't know it, and I turn around, I jump. Probably you do the same thing. You probably had that experience of thinking you were going into an empty space and somebody goes, "Hi," and you're like, "Oh, stop, what did you do?" Well, can you imagine these three women crawling into this little tiny hole, this little black space that goes into a place of death, the place where there's not supposed to be any sound, nobody's going to be talking, and all of a sudden somebody goes, "Hello, ladies." Before they could make their escape, the young man spoke. Verse 7. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Creation had groaned with the grinding of tectonic plates and the shattering of rock the moment that Jesus died. Now heaven, through this messenger, announced that here, in this place where Jesus' body had lain dead just hours before, he had risen. This old earth, if you will, had just given birth to the resurrected Son of God. And at that moment, these three women were the only human beings to know the good news. It was on them to tell Peter, the other disciples, and ultimately you and me. Now, we tend to like our stories to be neat and tidy. Think about what happens when you go to the movies. You get in there, and whatever the movie might be, maybe it's a romance, maybe it's science fiction, maybe it's an action thriller. Over the course of the early part of the movie, all kinds of problems are introduced, and all kinds of possibilities. And the goal of the writer is to completely, in a sense, confuse you and tantalize you so that you'll watch the whole movie. So the boy meets girl, or the hero gets in trouble, or things happen, and as you go deeper into the movie, you have this feeling of wanting to know how it's going to work out, not quite sure it's going to turn out the way you want. If they're good, when they write the movie, they get you just suspenseful enough, or just frightened enough, or just intrigued enough. You try to figure it all out, and of course you know no matter how hard you try to figure it out, they're a step ahead of you because they wrote this to keep your attention all the way through. But what do you think about that movie? You know at any given time, when this baby's over, I'm going to have the answer to all the questions. In fact, you could pull out your phone or your watch, and you could probably take a look and go, we've got 7 minutes left in this movie. That means we're going to find out who done it in about the next 2. That means the boy will get the girl in the next 30 seconds. It's scripted. And it's scripted because we demand that our stories be neat and tidy. We want them to work out somehow. Even the sad ones, even the tragic ones, we need to know how it ends. You go to the library, or you go to the bookstore, or you download a book on your device, and there you're reading this novel. You know, no matter how confusing that murder mystery may be, no matter how many other people might be possible suspects, that the author is going to tell you at the end of the story exactly how it turns out. We want our stories not only to have intriguing beginnings, but very nice, neat and tidy endings where all the loose ends are tied up. And that brings us to Mark's story of Jesus. The original text of the Gospel of Mark ends in a way that is anything but neat and tidy. Here is how the original ending of Mark reads, verse 8. "Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." The end. Really? That's it? Trembling, bewildered, terrified, dumbstruck, running for their very lives. The end. Well, how would you feel if you were in a little 6x6x6 black tomb? Somebody started talking to you about the person you were supposed to be doing the funeral for being alive. There are 3 of you, and the hole you all have to get out of is this by this. You've heard the old jokes about how many people you can fit in a Volkswagen or how many people you can fit in a phone booth. How many little Jewish ladies could you fit through a hole this big at one time? And that's all they were thinking about. Get me out of here. No wonder pious copyists felt compelled to write a more satisfactory ending. That's why your Bible has verses 9 through 20. But if you look in, say, the newer versions of the Bible, you will note that they tell you the earliest manuscripts, copies of the Bible, didn't have these verses. Because that's not the story Mark's trying to tell us. His story ends with verse 8. Not neat and tidy. You see, in Mark's story, the women stagger out into a brand new world. They knew how the world worked when they crouched down to enter the tomb. They had absolutely no grid for the world they re-entered when they fled from the tomb. Trembling, bewildered, terrified, and dumbstruck, running for their lives, these emotions are like those people experienced when they caught a glimpse of Jesus' majesty and power during his time here on this earth. When Jesus calmed the storm, Mark tells us the disciples, Mark 4:41, were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." They thought the storm was bad. And then when the God of the storm showed up and calmed the storm, and they're stuck in the boat with him, they felt like those ladies trying to get out of that little 2-foot by 2-foot doorway, and there was nowhere to go. So were the women asking each other, "Who is this? Even death and the grave obey him." This wasn't the neat and tidy end of a story. Even if it was a sad or tragic story, Jesus, a wonderful person, gifted by God, doing healings, proclaiming God's kingdom, being betrayed by his own disciple, being strung up on a cross, dying in agony, and then buried in a tomb. That's the story that, in its own way, has a conclusion. It's a sad story. It's a tragic story. But it has an ending. This story was something else. This is the beginning of a totally new story, a story that had never been imagined, much less ever told before. There was no grid for this story. There was a belief in Jesus' time that at the end of all time, God would raise people from the dead. Now, that was a controversial belief. Not even all the Jewish people agreed on that. But everybody that did believe in it, believed that it would happen at the end of time. There was never any expectation that even one person, Messiah or otherwise, would be raised from the dead in our time. No grid for that. You know, our stories, the stories that we live, the story you're living right now, as you make sense of your life, as you try to kind of piece together how to move forward, our stories are always an extension of what we already know. Mark tells us that God's story is most definitely not an extension of anything you already know. It'll blow you out of the water. It'll squeeze you through the tiny tomb door out into a world you never knew existed. You won't have words for this new world and this new story. You will just have to start living it. Scary? Out of your comfort zone? Welcome to God's new world. But you see, out there in that new world, Jesus is waiting for you. Just as he was waiting for those women. They bolted out of that tomb and, it was after you, my dear, and squeezed themselves through that little doorway, ran in total silence. They had no words for what had happened. But when their hearts calmed down and when their emotions began to settle and they began to try to piece this all together, there was that promise. He's waiting for you in Galilee. He's here. He's in this space that you thought you understood. He's in this world. You thought you knew how it works. Doesn't work that way anymore. God has just set off the life bomb in the middle of death's realm. And the same is true for you and me. In this new world that Jesus is daring us to go out and explore, Jesus is waiting for us. You will find him, and he will find you. Remember, this old world has nothing for you. In this old world with its old story, your biggest concern will be to move the stone out of the way of a tomb door so that you can bury one more loss, one more disappointment, one more failure. The temptation of that little dark hole that is there in every one of our stories is that when we feel sufficiently hurt, we'll just crawl in there and give in to self-pity. When we're sufficiently terrified, we'll just crawl in there and hope that somehow the darkness will protect us, even though we have no hope for the future. When we've been told that a situation is now true in our lives, maybe a diagnosis of a disease or something that has happened in our relationships, we go into that dark place and take a new label and put it on our lives. From now on, I'm no longer what I was, but I'm defined by this other thing. Whether it be a medical condition or a marital status or some breakdown in our relationships. Somehow it's safer to just make our stories fit the brokenness of the world than to go out of that door into a world where none of our definitions work, where we receive a new name, where we receive a brand new identity, and where the same Jesus who rose on that day, April the 5th, the year 33, is waiting for us. This old world with its old story has nothing for you. Take a look around in there. You won't find Jesus in that space. Even though he was there, they carried his body into that tomb, into that place of loss and death. But look around, he's not there. He's risen. You won't see an angelic messenger giving you the news. No, you have the verbal report of 3 little Jewish ladies. That's good enough for me. See the place where they laid him. And then go out into God's brand new creation and let him find you. That's the challenge that Mark leaves us with. Mark says, no, I'm not going to give you a neat and tidy story. I'm not going to give you a story that has a front flap and a back flap so that when you get to the end, you go, aha, there, I read it, I know it, and you put the book on the shelf and you go on with the rest of your life. Oh no, Mark didn't do that. He left us with a ... story. He left us with 3 wonderful, brave Jewish women running out of a garden. And then he says, and you're one of them. What are you going to do next? I want to encourage you that whatever your story, and isn't it great that we don't have to fit ours into somebody else's? Whatever your story, wherever you are in your life right now, whatever's going on, whatever might want to keep you in that dark space that is familiar, whether it be doubt, maybe you don't even believe that there is such a thing as a God. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's disappointment. Maybe it's questions about how could the world be the way it is. Maybe it's your own hurt or loss, looking at yourself and saying, I would never be worthy of any more than this place. No matter what it is, I want to challenge you to do what those women did. Squeeze yourself back out into a world that you never, ever knew. Because when you do, you will find that the person who was supposed to be in the tomb is looking for you. Let's bow our heads together. Brian? Our Father, help us see our stories, not through the familiar things of this world and our lives, but in a brand new way. I pray, Lord, for anyone who might be here this morning who is in some way on a faith journey that is helping them ask the questions that only you can answer. And Lord, we don't have any pat answers. We don't have a little neat package story that answers all of our questions about our lives and then helps us just feel like we're totally in control. Father, we're living a story that has never been lived before. And I pray, Lord, if there's anyone here who has not yet come out of that little dark tomb into your brand new world, that you would give them the courage to say, God, I'm going to dare to believe that it's worth stepping out of my space into your space. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that feels like. I don't know how that's going to work. But I'm daring to believe that you conquered death, that you're present in a way that a human being can know and feel and experience. I'm going to meet your son Jesus in some sense and some way and become his follower. And Lord, I pray that you would just give that courage to any one person who needs to do that this morning. And we give you the thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.